Slaves never received an education, of course, and it was a crime to teach slaves to read or write in many states. Of course, a literate slave would be a slave that could potentially revolt, could lead others into revolt, could escape and lead others to escape as well. And so Southerners, plantation owners, did everything they could to try to prevent education from spreading into the plantation. Alrighty. Hey, I think what's fascinating about all of this is despite all of these efforts by these slave holders, we see an African American culture develop on the plantation. It's this incredible mix, folks, of language, of oral traditions, right, of passing down stories verbally, already. This amazing music that develops on the plantation, religious patterns. Certain religions are going to emerge, mixtures of all of these things, and family patterns, unique family relationships develop as well. All of this forms an American slave community. Later on, this is going to emerge into our African American community. One of our first distinct groups ever is this group that's going to emerge on the plantation, blending together of all these different forces. One of our most native and natural American groups that's ever to be formed. Alrighty, let's look at what we mean here. Family ties are informal. Extended family, large families, extended families. Oftentimes, they would refer to one another maybe as uncle or aunt, even if they weren't a member of the family, because on the plantation, so many actual families have been broken up. All right, so it was almost like family members would be adopted in from you know, an individual would be adopted into a family if they didn't have anybody else. There was this term called fictive kin, again, where you referred to people as family, as brother or sister or aunt or uncle, even if they weren't necessarily a blood relation on the plantation. Children were raised by the mothers, generally. Moms oftentimes ruled the home in slave quarters, alrighty. That's a tradition that goes all the way today with many African American families, alrighty. Children were looked after by the community, by many moms, by many women on the plantation. It was almost like a group effort where you were responsible for keeping an eye on all of the children as well. Oral traditions, verbal traditions. Look, since slaves were unable to read and write, and they were, it was illegal to teach them to do so. A lot of times they would pass down stories, information, traditions orally, verbally from one generation to the next. They become great storytellers, excellent storytellers, and that's how many of these traditions and parables and analogies get passed down to us from the plantation, verbally, from one generation to the next. By the way, I'm on slide 41. They're oral traditions passed down in several languages. We have new kind of languages that are going to emerge that are a mixture of African tongues with English, also maybe some Caribbean tongue or some Caribbean words in there as well. We have these special kind of mixed languages. One is called Gullah, it's spoken in the South. One is called Creole, it's spoken in the Deep South along the Gulf Coast. Pidgin English, which is a mixture of native languages with English, where you use words from each. Certain stories became very popular on plantations. You guys probably have been to Disneyland. You've seen the characters, the Brer Rabbit characters, Brer Rabbit, Brer Brer, on the Splash Mountain ride. Those characters are all over. Those were actually characters that were invented on the plantation. What they did was they constantly got away. And they kind of represented slaves getting away as well from the master, from this cruel, oppressive life that they lived. Alrighty, later on Disney bought it, turned it into kind of this more cartoonish sort of story. Alrighty, almost like a Tom and Jerry like story. Anyways, important to remember that was originally a slave story, an example of this verbal tradition. Alrighty, religion. Look, I think you probably have seen black churches before if you've ever seen Forrest Gump or some of these other movies. There's a lot of back and forth between the church leader and then the congregation. Like, can I get an amen? Amen. I'm feeling the power. I hear you, brother. Alrighty. That's called call and response, where the preacher is giving calls out to the folks, and then the folks are responding back to him. Almost like a conversation back and forth. Very active, very energetic. That's a plantation tradition that emerged on the plantation at slave religious meetings. Alrighty. Religion was key for slaves. They didn't have a lot of options, and so they really got themselves, many of them became, converted to Christianity, or at least blended Christian beliefs with some of their old African beliefs. Again, maybe some Caribbean beliefs, like from when some of the generations might have been there, alrighty, and plantations in the Caribbean as well. Sometimes Christianity was encouraged by the whites. And so, of course, it was a way for blacks to acclimate to Southern society, and to maybe, excuse me, and maybe get into the good graces, alrighty, of the plantation owner. All right. So, anyways, religion, yeah, another just a huge factor in the development of slave culture, African American culture. Alrighty. Especially Christianity. Christianity had a lot of messages that appealed to slaves. You know, Moses saving his people, the Exodus. You know, saving yourself from slavery, from bondage, finding freedom. Obviously, those were optimistic, uplifting messages that appealed to slaves who were stuck in this terrible situation. Music. Music was very rhythmic. African traditions are a lot of drum rhythms, a lot of beats, a lot of rhythm in the music. Also, interestingly enough, the banjo, actually, you know, was actually an African musical instrument as well. Alrighty. So anyways, a lot of times music, especially drums, was forbidden on the plantation, or at least instruments were. And so in an effort to try to simulate kind of the rhythms they were used to, a lot of times they would do kind of call and response, where they would kind of do the same sort of singing. One person would sing the verse and then everybody would sing the chorus together, back and forth, back and forth. You know, they're going to kind of develop fast rhythms. They're going to kind of develop a system where they would kind of pat their own body. Alright, it was called patting juba to keep the beat. Alrighty, folks, the musical traditions, they learned the use of the banjo, which was sometimes used illegally. You know, hidden from the master. The fiddle, alrighty, which is borrowed by slaves and becomes part of their traditions as well. Hey, they're going to lead to the development of blues, of jazz, of rock and roll. All of those musical traditions are a direct effect of African American slave culture that was formed on the plantation. Without that, we would not have those amazing cultural legacies. All right, that's one very small, bright, I guess, silver lining on this horrible thing that was slavery. Because hey, next slide, slide 45. The slave system was brutal. It was so burdensome. It took away your humanity, your dignity, all right, your self-respect. You know, they suffered incredible physical, emotional, psychological abuse and torture. They were constantly convinced they were inferior. You're going to watch a video that I'm going to post now on the Haiku page, actually, as part of this assignment, where you're going to see what I mean. All right? They were denied education. They were seen as dangerous by slave owners. You know, hey, I'm going to tell you right now, don't think the slaves just were like, okay, I'm the slave, I'm going to take it. They did everything they could to resist. A lot of times they had to do so very quietly. They might break equipment. They might, you know, work as slow as possible. In some instances, we saw them even try to poison maybe the family or the slave owner to try to get away. Alrighty, so it wasn't like we have thousands and thousands of examples of slaves trying to resist or revolt, and we do have some very major examples of that as well. Of course, the most common way of resisting was to try to escape. Alrighty, and slaves, of course, oftentimes tried to escape. They tried to run away. Of course, that was a life or death situation. If they were caught, if they were apprehended, they would be brought back to the plantation. They might be killed. They would definitely be tortured or abused to try to convince others not to go. Alrighty, let's look at some of the major slave revolts, and of course that means we're on slide 47. First slave revolt, of course, is the Stono Rebellion. Alrighty, we already covered that, let's remember. That occurred during colonial times. Alrighty, it's the only major colonial slave revolt. That was in South Carolina. Remember, they tried to flee to Florida. They killed whites along the way. They kind of got sidetracked, and they got caught. This led to these oppressive slave codes, some of the most oppressive slave codes ever. And crackdowns on, you know, slave, what limited rights or freedoms they had before that. Okay. Second major slave revolt is called the Gabriel Prosser Revolt. He was actually a skilled slave. He was a blacksmith. All right, so he had some skill. He tried to actually plan a revolt. He recruited 150 people. Ultimately, what happened is, under interrogation, some of these guys basically, informed the whites about this plan. Prosser, most of the people, most of the leaders of his plan before it could actually take place were hanged. They were killed. Alrighty, third, Denmark Vesey. This is probably the most famous. He planned a large revolt, alright, in 1822. It never actually materialized either. Alrighty. Again, an informer, gave them up and informed on them. Vesey and others as well were hanged. But of course, every time one of these slave revolts was uncovered, even if it hadn't happened yet, it led to more fear, more crackdowns by the South, who become more and more convinced that it's only a matter of time before all blacks rose up against them. And then, of course, Nat Turner's. This, after those first three, becomes by far the one everybody remembers, all right, Nat Turner, because, well, it happened, unlike Gabriel Prosser and Denmark Vesey. Again, what happens here is in Virginia, Nat Turner is going to lead this huge revolt. Alrighty. Ultimately, again, they kind of turn their frustration, their anger on the whites, including women and children. They were trying to capture weapons and spread them around to spread the rebellion, to make it larger. Even though it was the largest ever in the South, they got sidetracked. Eventually, they were killed and apprehended. Turner was hanged in response. All right. So again, we had 4 slave revolts. We had the Stono. We have Gabriel Prosser and Denmark Vesey, which technically occur, are uncovered before they occur. And then we have the most famous, the largest, the most widespread. That's the Nat Turner Revolt in 1831. Alrighty. Slide 50 shows you the image of depicted by whites, by Southern whites, where you see blacks slaughtering whites. This, of course, is to raise fear, raise awareness, and to try to get more Southerners to protect their institution. Alrighty, what's the significance of all of these revolts, these 4? Well, again, they're going to produce this incredible anxiety, this incredible fear. It's going to result in harsher and harsher laws, more violence, more brutality, more crackdowns against the slaves to try to prevent them from engaging in this behavior in the future. Alrighty, slide 52 shows you just a wonderful, wonderful image of the slave insurrections that occurred. These are large slave insurrections. Alrighty, so we're talking about large ones, not individual or small examples. Again, as you can see, there were many, many famous examples of slave revolts. I don't want you to think, just because we focus on those 4, that those were the only ones. Alrighty, 53. Alrighty, slide 53. Again, Southerners become almost paranoid, very paranoid about these slave revolts. They become convinced they're going to happen more and more. They become more and more hostile and angry at the North, who they blame, especially abolitionists, for inciting these insurrections. All right. Let's finish up here with the white majority. Alrighty, and the mountain whites. We've got a few slides actually to finish up with here. Alrighty, so slide 54, the white majority. Okay. Look, even in 1860, even at the start of the Civil War, only 25% of Southerners actually owned slaves. Alrighty. Most did not. Alrighty, and those that did, overwhelmingly didn't own a lot. Alrighty. Most, of the masters, they were usually smaller slave owners. Alright, there were very few large plantations. Again, like I've said multiple times. 3 out of every 4 Southerners didn't own slaves at all. But they almost always supported slavery, even though they didn't own them. Alrighty. A lot of times these folks were located in the back country, in mountainous areas, where there might not have as much wealth or need for slaves. Alrighty. Many times they were subsistence farmers. Maybe they raised corn. They raised hogs, I should say. They grew corn. Sometimes these were the poorer of the groups, alrighty, that were kind of ridiculed. They were called white trash sometimes by the planters, alrighty. They did still support slavery, alrighty, because to them it proved that whites were superior to blacks, and they needed that because, hey, economically they're not much better than blacks, alrighty, and so, hey, they wanted there to be this racial difference because, hey, at least psychologically, at least, publicly, socially, they'd still be higher than a group of people, okay. Again, Southerners determined your social status and your wealth by how many slaves you owned. It was your measure of your status in the South. Alrighty, and of course, a lot of times what white plantation owners would do, they would use these lower class whites. They would use these guys to help discipline, punish, keep their slaves in line. Alrighty, that way they can keep their poor whites and their slaves in line at the same time. Remember, the poorest of the poor were the mountain whites. They generally were opposed to slavery. We've kind of already mentioned them. They usually lived in the Appalachians. You're going to kind of think of them as like the hillbillies, alrighty. They were small farmers. They lived in the rough territory. Many of them were those old Scots-Irish. Again, they despised planters. They didn't like slaves. Oftentimes during the Civil War, they actually supported the Union. Alrighty. Finally, free African Americans. Hey, there's 250,000 in the South, about the same number of free African Americans in the South as there was in the North. Alrighty. Especially in the border states. Alrighty, a lot of free blacks in the border states. In the lower South, usually to be a free black, you had to be a mulatto. Alrighty. Now, hey, some blacks were granted their freedom by the master. Others bought it. They earned it by a trade. They made money. Their owner let them do that on the side, and they were able to buy their freedom eventually. Some actually owned property, if you can believe it. Some blacks actually owned slaves. Alrighty. Was there discrimination in the South? Yes, of course, tons, as you would expect. Alrighty. They had no legal rights. They weren't allowed to testify in court. They couldn't sue whites. They were almost always in danger of maybe being forced back into slavery again. If you ever get a chance to see 12 Years a Slave, you can kind of see that firsthand. Alrighty, in the North there were 250,000 free blacks as well, same number. They usually lived in large communities together in big cities like New York and Philadelphia. They were centered life in African American society. Free black life was centered around the African American church. Alrighty, they really were the center of their society. They kind of kept these groups together in these communities. Alrighty, they were kind of like the glue. The leaders of the church were oftentimes the most powerful or important person in that community. Alright. These African American churches are also going to be kind of the cauldrons where the abolitionist movement is going to develop. Alright, is there discrimination in the North? Yes, a ton, more than you might have expected as well. In some instances, Southern African Americans didn't have access to education. Some states actually kind of slowed down, prevented the number of free blacks from coming in every year. They only let a minimum number in. Some didn't give blacks full suffrage, others segregated them publicly. Of course, in many northern cities, there were constant chronic fights and riots between blacks and Irish immigrants and other immigrant populations. Alrighty, so there was almost like this feeling, this perception that that even though the Northerners were opposed to the concept of slavery, they didn't really treat blacks much better than Southerners did once those blacks were free. Alrighty, folks, that takes us to slides 63, 64, and 65, and that's where we're going to move to next in my next video that I'll be posting here momentarily. Until then, signing off, Mr. Majewski. We'll finish up the second part of slavery.